stage for you. When I was reading the paper early this morning and listening to NPR, I heard reports of wide-scale looting and anarchy, burning of government buildings in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq. And the question arises, obviously, as far as can order be restored in that country, how quickly, and what type of regime should be put in its place. Deputy Secretary of Defense Wolfowitz was testifying on Capitol Hill just yesterday, as I recall, talking about the Department of Defense's plan for installing an interim government. And the State Department, as I understand, does not necessarily embrace that same concept. So as I indicated to you yesterday, I think we are witness to history in the making, not only with regard to Iraq, but on the future shaping of international relations and to some extent domestic politics in this country. This morning we're going to have a panel entitled Rebuilding the Nation, the Issue of Democratization, which touches on those things. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague from Duke Law School, Professor Joost Pauwelyn. Joost?
Well, thank you, Scott. As the stage is already set by the chair, that leaves me with little else to do. But I also wanted just to put this day in somewhat of a context. I know that you've discussed yesterday the issue of weapons inspections, that you have put the Iraqi situation in context, in regional context, and that you've also discussed the legality or otherwise of the U.S. intervention. Of course, with the war being won, although according to some not yet over, the issue of rebuilding is on everyone's mind. And I think the two panels of today will be talking about this question of rebuilding. Our first panel here present will basically focus on the future. We'll try to examine how we can democratize Iraq. The second panel will look back and talk about accountability. So basically looking back at the crimes that were committed in the past and see how we can deal with that past to create a better future. So our first panel here is on rebuilding, having a democracy in Iraq. And for that we have four very prominent speakers, and I'm really looking forward to hear them. I will present them in the order that they were going to speak. So on my immediate left we have Scott Carpenter, who's from the U.S. State Department. He's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. And he also serves on the Interagency Executive Steering Group on Iraq. Before joining the State Department, he was at the International Republican Institute, which promotes democratic development around the world. I'm a trade lawyer myself, so I'm very happy to see that before that, he worked on the NAFTA desk of the International Trade Agency. And Scott has a graduate degree from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced Studies, specializing in something that may also be of interest here, European studies. Next to him is Marina Ottaway. She will talk after him. And she's with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she's a senior associate in the Democracy and Rule of Law project. Her latest book is entitled Democracy Challenge, which offers a comparative study of semi-authoritarian regimes in Africa, Caucasus, Latin America, and the Middle East. She's also a lecturer in the Johns Hopkins University. Now, the third speaker will be Robert Satloff, who's with the Washington Institute for Near East Studies, and where he's the Director of Policy and Strategic Planning. He's an expert on Arab and Islamic politics, as well as U.S. policy towards the Middle East. And his latest book is entitled War on Terror, the Middle East Dimension. He has degrees from Oxford University, Harvard University, and more importantly, Duke University. And then finally, our last speaker is Alan Buchanan, who is also at Duke University, at the Stanford Institute of Public Policy, where he's a professor of public policy studies and a professor of philosophy. Now, one of his areas of research is political philosophy, including the ethics in international relations. Now, my hope as a chair really is that we will be able to transcend the practicalities and the personality questions we hear on CNN these days. Of course, they are very important, but I hope we will be able to also tackle some of the deeper conceptual questions, such as, is the US goal really to impose democracy or to have a regime that is friendly towards the US? What kind of a democracy are we talking about? Is it necessarily a liberal democracy? And what should this democracy look like? When will we write the constitution, before the elections, after the elections? How will we take care of the ethnical divide within the country? Now, the other question one could address, and I hope the speakers will address, is the question of whether democracy can how it be imposed, or is it something that should come from within? And in that context, perhaps the question of whether it would facilitate the process if the US would not go through this process alone, but perhaps do it with the help of the international community. Now, I also hope that we can transcend what is in the news today, perhaps by looking beyond the situation in Iraq. Discuss a little bit what we can learn from history, because this is not entirely new, and hopefully also address the question of the future, what comes after this situation in Iraq, what comes after that particular conflict. So let me give the floor then to Mr. Carpenter, our first speaker. Thank you. And if I may remind the speakers, 15 minutes each, so that we have plenty of time for questions.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Joost. Thank you, Scott. I think I first need to clear up something very important. There are never any interagency divisions on any subjects. I'd like to do a couple things today. I'd like to put our policy towards Iraq in context, talk a little bit about what we're thinking about, but recognizing that a lot of the questions that Joost raises are going to be best addressed in the Q's and A's. Because I think that you all will have very specific questions, and I hope to have very specific answers. We do want a democracy in Iraq. There is a good deal of interagency agreement on some of the shapes of the structures that would create the interim arrangement. But beyond that, a lot has to be filled in by the Iraqis themselves in order to talk about that. But I think I want to start at the beginning, which is to say that democracy is our objective, and to give a little bit of context as to why. I think it needs to be reiterated time and again that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. This utterance of Winston Churchill is not, despite its oft repetition, a cliche. It is a truth. It is a truth that too many of us, foreign policy hammers and hawers, dance around. We buy into, to a certain extent, suspecting it or not, intentionally or not, that the authoritarian argument that stability at any price is worth preserving. But by whichever rationalization we come to such a conclusion, that statement remains alive. We have to manage realistically these issues, but we cannot say that in the best of all possible worlds, having a democracy would not be a good thing. There are too many people that are suffering under regimes terrorizes them. What we have in the current situation in Iraq is the international community's opportunity to act on its convictions and to rid that country of a brutal dictator. This is hardly outside the mainstream of foreign policy. There have been numerous moments in American history when realism has been confused and collided with a more Wilsonian naivete. When Truman's administration sought to remake a divided Germany in a democratic image, or when even more audaciously MacArthur was ordered to democratize a formerly imperial Japan, there were many, including many within my own department, who mocked such efforts. It will never happen. You cannot do it. They failed to understand the importance of such admonitions for American security. And then, of course, there was President Reagan's famous Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech. That, coupled with the evil empire speech, the Westminster speech, created the expectation on both sides of the Iron Curtain that Soviet communism contained the seeds of its own demise. Ostpolitik never had that kind of power. In the aftermath of the Cold War, there was the West's battle, physical and philosophical, with Milosevic, Tudjman, Mečiar, that led to final liberty for the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, ushering in a new positive dynamic for those who would choose a European democratic future. Now only Lukashenko's surreal anachronism remains on that continent. With September 11th, I think, the blurry line between Wilson and Kissinger disappeared to a greater extent than ever before. No longer could a democratic exception continue to persist in the Middle East. That exception had led to the collapse of the Twin Towers. A new realism was now and is now operative. How do I know that? For one thing, the head of policy planning at State, many of you will know, Ambassador Richard Haas, the protege of the great man himself, Kissinger, he said so. And when Richard declared last December that promoting greater democracy in the Muslim world was critical to our national security, the battle, in my view, was over. To hear Richard Haas utter the words democracy and national security in the same sentence was a very strong signal that something had changed. The link between democracy and national security was no longer a rhetorical flourish, but a hard-nosed policy. That many in the foreign policy community have failed to recognize this is not their fault. They have become so accustomed to the U.S. government putting such issues of human rights and democracy on the back burner in the name of other national interests that their skepticism, not to say cynicism, was to be expected. But if there's anything I can leave you with today, let it be this. This administration is committed to democratization, and not as an excuse to undermine other regimes or to capture oil revenues or to increase American hegemony, as the Chinese like to call it. President Bush pushes for, advocates democracy because doing so makes sense as a key element of national security policy. Doing so protects the United States and its citizens. Obviously, this new policy for us has created a good deal of dissonance in the Arab Muslim world, and is not without its inconsistencies. But inconsistencies notwithstanding, one can easily look to the diplomatic and programmatic policies created collaboratively within my bureau, for instance, and the Near East Asia Bureau, together with a very strong support from the NSC and the President himself, to see that there is, in fact, a wholly different operational concept at work. And I know I'll hear a little bit about that from Marina. That there will be a period of adjustment by our partners and their citizens in accommodating this new emphasis is clear, and again, it's understandable. We will need to do a lot of work to redress the so-called credibility gap that we face. But this was something that we've had to do before. Consider Central America in the 80s. when we started talking to the elites that we had been talking to for so long about keeping the communists down, that all of a sudden we were going to begin to insist on democratization, that they kind of laughed for a while, thought we were kidding for a while, but ultimately that credibility gap was filled. I raise all this to provide some overall context for the discussion about democratization in Iraq, to highlight the fact that regime change as a policy has always had, to use this term, embedded within it the idea of a change to something else. That something, ideally, is a liberal, largely secular, federal, unitary Iraq, able to secure and defend its borders, that treats its own people with dignity and respect for internationally recognized human rights. But the precise form of this new government is to be left to the Iraqis themselves to determine. As President Bush noted in late February at AEI, the U.S. has no intention of determining the precise form of Iraq's new government. That choice belongs to the Iraqi people. Yet, we will ensure that one brutal dictator is not replaced by another. All Iraqis must have a voice in the new government, and all citizens must have their rights protected. Just this week, the President, together with Tony Blair, again reiterated this view. This will, of course, be a huge challenge for the Iraqi people, and will require coalition assistance in the interim period to help them create a broad-based representative government. It will take resources, it will take dedication, and it will take time. Our initial effort, as you heard, and this is one thing that Scott said that is not true, the Department of Defense and Department of State, because the President has ordered it so, that our principal mechanism for civilian administration in the interim period is the J. Garner Initiative that was created by a National Security Policy Directive that the President signed. Our initial effort, therefore, will be led by J. Garner in the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, housed in the Pentagon. But to say that is to say that it is not to say that it is not a vast interagency behemoth. It is. There are people from Treasury, there are people from USAID, there are lots of people from state, there are people from EPA, from agriculture. A whole lot of folks are participating in that effort. Their goal is to restore basic services, to make sure that medicine, food, supplies are delivered to the people that they can begin to live normal lives. But even before that, even before Jay and company move in, Tommy Franks has to say all clear, that sufficient security and stabilization is available now for you all to move in. The threshold will be lower, of course, than if civilian organizations were to come in, NGOs, for instance. But in any case, there will be that transition. We have solicited contributions to the reconstruction effort from over 65 countries, constabulary forces, other security forces, potentially peacekeeping operations, but also experts to help us dismantle and eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction facilities, as well as engineering infrastructure experts to restore communications and transportation. We do have coalition participation out in Kuwait City with Jay even now. That's going to be the first stage. But as President Bush and Prime Minister Blair said a few days ago, quote, as early as possible, we support the formation of an Iraqi interim authority, a transitional administration run by Iraqis until a permanent government is established by the people of Iraq, end quote. Now, we will have to move quickly to transfer authority to Iraqis, initially through this IIA. Forming the IIA is the first step in establishing participatory norms in society. It cannot be parachuted in from the outside, and it must be seen to involve all Iraqis in order to gain broad support among the Iraqi population. But let us be clear, The legitimacy from the Iraqi Interim Authority will come from what the Iraqi Interim Authority does and how well or how poorly it meets the needs of the Iraqi people. The external political opposition that has been so much discussed in the press has an important role to play. They have fought for liberation of Iraq for years and have experience in democratic societies. They understand the President's vision for a future democratic Iraq. 20 million Iraqis have suffered under the Saddam Hussein regime and have not had the opportunity to actively participate in Iraq's political structures. The IIA is a critical opportunity for Iraqis to engage immediately in building a democratic Iraq. The U.S. must take advantage of the window of opportunity post-liberation and the political space created by the overthrow of the regime to establish the IIA in the most inclusive manner possible. We recognize that we will only have one shot at this. The IIA will be established first and foremost by Iraqis with the help of the coalition and working with the Secretary General of the UN. Getting the IIA right will change the international dynamic, we believe. An IIA broadly accepted as legitimate by the Iraqi people will strengthen our hand as we discuss future reconstruction opportunities. The coalition will, of course, retain control over budgets, hiring and firing, etc., in order to ensure that no abuse of power before proper checks and balances are well established can take place. We will be, in the absence of a constitution and elected bodies, we will, of necessity, be the checks and balances for the interim period. The Republic of Fear created by Saddam Hussein will leave deep and lasting scars. It will take a long time to heal. But know that the administration is committed to implementing the President's vision. We know the stakes are high, not only for the Iraqi people, but for the rest of our region, indeed the world. History will have to judge whether the undertaking that we have embarked on was worth the blood and treasure that we have expended. But we remain resolved to follow through, and we are hopeful. In any case, soon, very soon, all of Iraq will be liberated. And that freedom is already worth the price. I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Good morning. I'll try to pick up from some of the points made by Scott.
That's not allowed, Marina.
And then, I can pick up on your point, and then broaden the discussion. His comment is based on the fact that three of us last night had dinner together and we started the discussion last night. So in some ways, for us, it's a follow-up. Let me start with the first point, on which I completely agree with him. Yes, I do believe that the administration wants a democracy in Iraq. From then on, things become infinitely more complicated, because what I would argue is that what we want, and not only what we want and what is likely to happen differ, but also that what we want, the things we want are not necessarily compatible. And I think that is the problem. Number one, okay, we want a democracy, but we also want a democratic regime that embraces policies we like. That by itself is a very iffy proposition, because democratic regimes differ very much with each other in terms of the kind of policies they embrace. Democratic regimes in Europe do not see eye to eye with the United States on a lot of things. The democratic regime in Turkey did not see eye to eye with the United States on the war, and that's why we could not, the US military could not operate from bases in Turkey. So already to say we want democracy, but we also want a regime we like, becomes a completely different position. Third, we want a quick process, as Scott pointed out, leading first to the Iraqi Interim Authority and then later to a new government. why do we want that? We want this quick process because we cannot be seen as the occupying force in Iraq for a very long time. Times have changed from the days when U.S. occupied Germany and Japan for a long period of time. That was a world of, it was a colonial world, the world of 1945. It was a world in which most countries were occupied by somebody else. It was conceivable at that point to have a military occupation lasting for many years. It's not conceivable in today's world to have a military occupation lasting for many years. There is tremendous pressure on the United States to sort of stop being the occupying force as quickly as possible. There is also tremendous financial pressure to stop being the occupying power for as quickly as possible, because it's going to be very difficult to get other countries to help foot the bill while the US is the occupying power. If there was, in fact, a new Iraqi government, I think it would be much easier for a lot of countries that are reluctant to be seen as giving their blessing to the war to actually come in, or countries that in fact cannot provide aid by their own constitution, by their own laws, essentially, unless without the sort of the approval of UN for a cooperation. So I think there is a tremendous pressure on the US to get out of there as quickly as possible. We also want, number 4, we also want to maintain complete control on the transition, certainly on the transition up to the setting up of the Iraqi Interim Authority, and also up to the setting up of a new Iraqi government. The US has made it quite clear that it does not want the participation of the UN or of any other international agency except on the humanitarian relief side. And that is going to happen because UN humanitarian agencies have already made it clear not only that they are willing to participate, but that they have a duty to participate, and that under the Geneva Convention, the United States, as the occupying power, does not have the authority to ban any humanitarian agency to work in the country. So there will certainly be a multilateral effort on the humanitarian side, but on the political side, the US does not want to cede any control. Complicating the issue, and I think is the interagency problems that Scott denies exist, is the fact that it's not only the US wants to maintain control over the transition, but the Pentagon is giving all signs that it wants to maintain control over that transition. The tensions within the United States are very strong. There are tensions between the Pentagon and the State Department. There are tensions which I find very serious between the Pentagon and American humanitarian agencies. Some of the most important agencies, most important humanitarian groups in the United States, and I will not mention names, but I think you all know which ones they are, including some agencies that have, some NGOs that have already received contracts with USAID to provide humanitarian relief, are right now in the process of discussing whether or not they can operate in Iraq if the Pentagon is in charge of the relief operation. So the tensions within the United States itself on this point are extremely high. Okay, this is one side, I think, what we want, and some of the problems in terms of the contradictions. Let me just take the issue from a different point of view, and it is, we want a democracy, but what do we know about the democratic transitions? What do we know about democratic transformations? We have a tremendous amount of, we have gained a lot of experience in the 1990s. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there has been a tremendous wave of political transitions. I will not call them democratic transitions because not all of them have resulted in democracy. Actually, I would argue that a very large number of them, probably most of them, have not resulted in democracy. But we certainly know something about how these transitions unfold. And perhaps the most important thing about these transitions, if you look at what has succeeded and what has not succeeded, is that they take time. In other words, I think there is a contradiction in terms between the idea of a very quick transition to an Iraqi interim authority and a new Iraqi government, and the idea that the transition can be a democratic transition. Actually, I would argue that the quicker the process is, the less likely it is that it will result at the end in a democratic transition. There will be meetings. There is no doubt about it. There is a meeting scheduled for this weekend to bring together Iraqi exiles, some leaders from the inside, whoever they might be at this point. And I think we'll start seeing right away the process of trying to bring together these different groups to try to get to some agreement on an Iraqi interim authority. Can it be done? Sure, it can be done. It was done in Bonn. There was the Bonn meeting on Afghanistan, then in a few days sort of hammered out an interim authority for Afghanistan. Can it be done in such a way that it leads to democracy? That is very much open to discussion, and it's very much open to doubt, I would argue. The example of Afghanistan is not terribly encouraging, because if we look at what's going on in Afghanistan now, what is emerging is not a democratic government. It's a government where I think a leader who probably has democratic inclinations has been forced to bring into the government such of the worst warlords, because essentially he was not in a position to do anything else. So what I would argue is that the faster this process of leading to an interim authority is, the fewer are the chances for a democratic transition. Let me point out one of the most successful examples of democratic transition, of a post-conflict democratic transition, that we have witnessed in the recent period has been the transition in South Africa. Okay, where after the end of the apartheid regime, the country was either on the verge of civil war for much longer than a lot of people recognized at that point, and finally managed to move towards democracy extremely successfully. Let me point out that in a country which was nowhere nearly as divided, and I would say nowhere nearly as complex as Iraq was, it took 4 years of negotiations between 1990, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and 1994, when the elections were finally held. It took 4 years of negotiation among all the political organizations in the country to get to enough agreement that those elections could take place without a civil war breaking out. I'm not saying that you need 4 years of negotiations in Iraq. All situations are different, but I think it's good to keep in mind how long that process took. So I would argue that in this case, speed is very much an enemy of democracy. Another point that we have learned from studying democratic transitions, which is our political transition in the last 10 years, which is what we do at Carnegie, by the way, at least the program with which I am associated, is that a lot of these democratic transitions go badly. And a lot of these or the transition that we hope to be democratic do not lead to democracy. What does that depend on? And a very important fact, a very important factor in determining how much the likelihood that the transition will lead to democracy is what are the initial conditions. Those countries, there were tremendously successful transitions in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and so on and so forth. Countries where you had had for a long time before a political ferment, where you really had organizations that were ready to jump in the fray and to take over once the regime fell. In countries where you had not had that political ferment, in countries where the transition came as a result of something that happened somewhere else, and don't forget that the transition in Iraq is taking place as a result of something that the United States did, not as part of an internal process. In those countries where there was no internal process, we ended up with a very different scene. Number one, you have an example in the Balkans. We have not finished sorting out the Balkans yet, and I don't think we are anywhere close to sorting out the fallout of the transition in the Balkans. And the other example that to me is very depressing is that of Central Asia. And it's particularly depressing because these are the countries that, if you look at the countries where we are working now, like Afghanistan and in the future Iraq, in Central Asia you find countries that historically and culturally have something in common with these two countries. Countries where if I can just summarize very briefly, because we don't have that much time, is the process unfolds on the basis of what was there before. And if you look at Iraq, essentially, what we have is an extremely complex situation. It's a situation where not only there is no previous experience with democracy, but also you have a country which is extremely divided. It's extremely divided ethnically, it's extremely divided in terms of religion, it's extremely divided in terms of tribes, it's extremely divided between secular elements and Islamist elements and so on. And we really do not know how all these pieces can be combined. So that essentially, I'm not saying that it cannot happen, but in order to happen, I think there has to be a long process to take place. If we try to put together the pieces, the past process on one side with the requirement of a democratic transition, what my conclusion is that we are that the process that has been devised at this point is not likely to lead to a democratic transition. Yes, we'll have an Iraqi interim authority. I have no doubt that that will be set up. I also have no doubt that the Iraqi interim authority will be set up quite quickly. Is this Iraqi interim authority going to have any legitimacy inside the country? We don't know. I think it depends on a lot of things. Is it going to have much legitimacy in the region? Probably not. I think at this point, any authority which is set up under the U.S. as an occupying power will probably have very little legitimacy in the area. Scott alluded to the problem of U.S. credibility in the area. The U.S. I think it's very important to keep in mind that the United States at this point has extremely low credibility in the Arab world, in the Middle East. That the reaction of the Arab press, the reaction of the Arab public to the war, but not to the talk of democracy promotion in the democracy promotion in the Middle East, has been enormously skeptical. I will just give you one example of this that I think is very telling to me about this degree of skepticism. And I will not mention names and I will not mention countries, but we have been negotiating to we have a program at Carnegie to bring visiting fellows from the Middle East to work with us for a period of 2 months. Every time we negotiate with somebody, at some point, and we start exchanging emails and start talking and so on, at some point you have to write the formal letter of invitation that you will be shown to that person's boss, right, to get permission. And the request that we always get is, talk about the Carnegie Endowment in the letter, do not talk about the project on democracy and rule of law. I mean, democracy is a dirty word. Democracy has become, unfortunately, in that part of the world, synonymous with the war in Iraq. So that essentially, what we are told is, don't mention democracy because you are going to be perceived as a pro-war organization. When we talk about credibility, when we talk about the problem of setting up an Iraq interim authority that will gain credibility in the area, I think these are issues that are going to be very important. Let me try to conclude. Where do we go from here? And what my answer to that is that I think the only way to get somewhere is to try to prolong the transition, to have a slower transition rather than a faster transition, to build in the time to try and work out some of these problems, to try and have a real process of negotiations among the various factions, the various groups. Not a process of negotiations, not the 3-day lawyer jirga in Afghanistan where all the decisions have been made beforehand, essentially, and the lawyer jirga came together to endorse decisions that were not even discussed at the meeting. But if you really want, in order to have a real process, we have a real transition, we have to prolong that process as much as possible, which then leads to the final and most difficult issue, because how can we prolong the process? And I think the answer here is there is only one way in which that process could be prolonged. That is, if it became much more of a multilateral process. In other words, if the U.S. was not seen as the sole occupying power during that period, that both would give more legitimacy to whatever interim authority government is set up through that process, but also would alleviate the problem for the United States to having to get out as quickly as possible because of the pressure that I on it at this point, at this time. I do not believe, frankly, that this is going to happen. I mean, I think the writing on the wall is pretty clear. I don't think that there is a chance, I think, that you will see this multilateral process. So the administration has made it quite clear that it wants the UN to come in a secondary role, and particularly in a humanitarian role, essentially, but certainly not in a political role. What that leads to, essentially, is the fact that we'll have a good transition. We'll set up an Iraqi interim authority that probably will have very little credibility, both in the country and abroad. And the outcome is much more likely to be that of a friendly regime, which is not very democratic, than of the democracy that we have been talking about. Thank you.
It's a very special pleasure for me to be here this morning. Let me first thank Scott Silliman for organizing this and inviting me, and especially thank Mr. Bruce Jentleson, the director of the Stanford Institute. Bruce and I have worked together over the years and have traveled around in some parts of this world we're talking about it. Riyadh, Jeddah, Amman, Jerusalem together, and it's delightful to be back here to be here with Bruce. It's especially delightful because this is my 20th reunion weekend, which I can't stay for, regrettably. I have to get back because I'm hosting my own conference on these issues starting tomorrow. But I do fondly recall 20 years ago talking not about Iraq, but about other Middle East issues on this campus, Israeli issues, and it's a testament to Duke that it is always on the cutting edge, and I'm delighted that this conference reflects that. I'm not here to speak for the U.S. government, though I know a little bit about planning on this. That's Scott Carpenter's role, and Scott has done it ably, and I think that Scott is chomping at the bit to get back at some of the comments that Marina made. What I'd like to do is offer what I think is the most useful contribution I can make, are insights based on what is my dual experience. I work in Washington, but I live in the Arab world. And so from that unique vantage point made possible by the wonders of telecommuting these days, I know what is going on pretty much inside the corridors of Washington, but I also know what's going on in the streets of Arab capitals. I wake up in the morning and meet and talk with Arabs from throughout the Middle East, and yet I email about 150 times a day to colleagues in and out of the U.S. government. So with that confluence of experiences, I'd like to offer a few comments. First, the question of democratization that we're talking about this morning, like others surrounding Iraq policy and even larger U.S. Middle East policy, I think is hounded by myth, conspiracies, and many false choices. Away from Iraq, let me just describe one of them, one of these myths. There is a myth about the Islamophobia of U.S. Middle East policy, a myth that even way before 9/11, but especially since 9/11, U.S. policy, U.S. leaders, U.S. officials have adopted positions, made statements, advocated approaches that animate from a fear of, hatred of, loathing of contemporary Islam. It is absolutely, completely, profoundly, totally unfounded, and without a single shred of evidence. I actually wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations in the year 2000 on U.S. policy toward Islamism, Islamism being the ideology that advocates the forceful imposition of Islamic law in Muslim-majority countries. And what I found in looking at U.S. policy toward Islamism as opposed to U.S. approaches toward the religion of Islam, and what I found over the course of the 1990s, I looked at 10 years, is that there wasn't a single statement ever made by an appointed U.S. government official that could in any way, shape, or form be characterized as Islamophobic. What you had was the odd statement by a crazy congressman from somewhere who has not a single Muslim in his constituency. But that certainly does not reflect the view of the U.S. government. It never did. What you have in contrast in many parts of the Middle East is an American-phobic approach, a Western-phobic approach, which is manifested not in the crazy statement of a congressman in the middle of nowhere, but in the official state media and by leaders who represent the highest reaches of their governments. It is a canard. Now, when we turn to Iraq, there are many of these sorts of myths, conspiracies, and false choices that have been uttered over the last year, and that have been uttered over the last 3 weeks, and that have been uttered, I am afraid to say, over the last 20 minutes. Let me just go through some of them. There's the apocalypse not now false choice, namely the idea that the war in Iraq was going to unleash World War III. 20,000 Americans would get killed, chemical weapons would rain on Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv would respond with nuclear weapons on Baghdad. If you think I'm making up this scenario, this was General Brent Scowcroft in the Wall Street Journal, who published this just several months ago. Of course, none of this happened, and we weren't even close. Then there's the House of Cards hoax, the idea that Iraq is so fragile that it is divided between Kurds in the north, Sunni Arabs in the center, Arab Shiites in the south, and that if we go in and don't do this with the delicacy of a diamond cutter, then Iraq will collapse, the Kurds will declare independence, the Shiites will call in the Iranians from next door, the Iranian army will be marching up through Basra, the Turks will come over the northern border in droves, the Syrians will have to come in to secure the Sunni Arabs in the center, and lo and behold, we will have a Middle East conflagration that will look like the Balkans in the First World War. Well, that also was a hoax, a conspiracy theory that had little more than a kernel of truth, because, as we now know, the greatest danger to the unity of Iraq was itself Saddam Hussein's rule. Because it was Saddam Hussein's role in Baghdad that made possible the fact that the Kurds were operating nearly independently in the north. It was Saddam Hussein's rule itself that was much more likely to bring about the collapse of the national territorial integrity of Iraq than any of its alternatives. And I think, as we are seeing now, and we are likely to see, that if this fear proved not to be a fear at all. Then there's this morning's in today's newspaper, the conspiracy theory, what I call the domino dash, that now we have forces in Iraq, a couple of 100,000, they can move east toward Iran, they can move west toward Syria. Where's the next place our U.S. forces are going to go to bring about the next domino change of regimes in the Middle East? Well, as far as I know, this just is preposterous. That there is no intention, no planning, no idea to take the U.S. forces that are currently inside Iraq, who have enough job doing a 500-kilometer supply line, pacifying 27 million people, creating a new country, de novo, for them to go east toward Iran or west toward Syria. There are ways in which the United States will take care, I believe, of the acts of Syria in the context of this war, and there are ways in which we will address the Iranian nuclear program. But I don't know anybody in Washington who is seriously considering pivoting east or pivoting west and going on for more dominoes. Then there's the conspiracy theory that I call the black gold idea. The fact that we ran into Iraq to put out the oil wells, and And this is really a sign that we're after the oil. If anybody here knows the least bit about the oil market, the least bit about U.S. economics, we would have far better off not going into this war at all, both in terms of our oil supply and in terms of our economic recovery, than we could possibly be by the amount of money expended on reconstruction in Iraq, the amount of time it will take to get the Iraqi oil pumping situation back to normal. This is clearly a conspiracy theory with no basis. Then there's what I call the theory of exile implantation. The idea that somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon there are 20, 50, 100, 2,000 Iraqi exiles that have been so well trained by us that we're going to parachute them into Baghdad and create a new government that walks, talks, and speaks like young Pentagon planners. Ahmed Chalabi and his company are robots acting on behalf of the U.S. government. This, of course, is preposterous. These are people, many of whom have been suffered from years of torture by Saddam's regime. They have given decades of their life to the fight for freedom in Iraq. They're not going to take orders from anybody, less us. They represent many different political points of view, and they will have a role to play. Not the predominant role, not the preeminent role, but an important role to play. And those who suggest that we have somehow handpicked an individual or a group, I just think that's just not reality. Then there's the tsunami red herring. The tsunami red herring is the argument that some have made, criticizing the view that democracy in Iraq, democratization in Iraq, might bring further political change around the Middle East. And they have taken this headline from an article by Josh Moravchik in Commentary that talks about the democratic tsunami in the Middle East and criticized the administration for having adopted this approach. Well, the fact is it hasn't. And I think there's not a single significant statement by a senior administration official suggesting that democracy will soon be reigning in Arab countries from Morocco to Qatar as a result of change in Iraq. What there will be, however, is change. And we've already seen Arab countries beginning to accommodate themselves to the idea that change is coming. Now, we've seen in just the last 2 months, for example, in Egypt, the Egyptians have released Saadin Ibrahim. They've appointed their first woman high court judge. They've made Orthodox Christmas a national holiday because of their cause. All these things targeted to appeal to us as a way to deflect what they know is coming. They know that change is coming. It's not sufficient, of course, but they know that it's coming. Now, does this mean a tsunami of democracy is coming? No. But does it mean that change is coming? Yes. Now, I think we've heard 3 other false choices, I would say, this morning. False choice 1 is the idea between a democracy and a country that supports U.S. policies. Now, there is a level of magnitude here one has to inject into this discussion. Yes, of course, the idea of democracy is the most important in the pursuit here. And yes, of course, there are democracies that disagree with the United States on issues. But what we're talking about in Iraq here is first-order questions. Is this a country that will choose as a matter of national priority to attack its neighbors? Or will it live in peace with its neighbors? Saddam Hussein's regime, of course, is the only regime that existed in the last generation that attacked 4 countries unpremeditated, without provocation. Kuwait, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Is it a country that will use gas against its citizens? Well, we disagree with the French on many things, but the French are not gassing their citizens. And I suspect that the next regime in Iraq will not be gassing its citizens as well. It's the fundamentals that we need to agree on with Iraq. It's not with a new Iraq. It is not the specifics of this basing decision, that deployment decision, this vote in the United Nations. Most of our strongest allies have horrible complementary voting records with the United States, in the United Nations. That's not the judge. The judge is the basic principle. And I think that we can have our cake and eat it too, in terms of having a regime moving towards democracy and a regime that abides by the general norms of international behavior, which is what we're looking for in Iraq. Secondly is the false choice about who should be running the transition period. The United Nations this week passed a Security Council resolution on oil for food in which it referred to the fact that, that there is a military occupation in Iraq, and the military occupying power has to abide by the rules of the Geneva Convention, etc. Well, if there's a military occupation in Iraq, then I would think it does not, I think it makes sense that there is military in charge of the military occupation, at least in the near term. And it would be a bit odd for us to have the first military occupation that didn't have military running the military occupation. Otherwise, it would be something else. Now, we need to do this and move to the next phase as quickly as possible, but we need to do this deliberately. Now, the third, I think, false choice is the false choice about credibility in the United States. Look, this is one of those imponderables, United States credibility. If anything, I would argue that the United States credibility in the Middle East in the last 26 days, 24 days, has gone way up, not way down. Because the United States actually did what it said it was going to do. What is credibility? Credibility is following through on what one says one is going to do. Credibility is not pandering to this side or that side. Credibility is following through on your word. And it is precisely because most governments in the Middle East actually were convinced that the United States was going to pursue this to the end, that most Arab governments accommodated themselves to this reality months ago. We did not have problems with our military deployments, really, in the Arab world. We never had a problem with our ships passing through the Suez Canal. We didn't have a problem in CENTCOM operating in Qatar, certainly not in Kuwait. Even our operations in Saudi Arabia were not a problem. And why? Because those governments, for some reason, actually were convinced that we were credible, that we were going to do this. Now, we still have this huge challenge in front of us. And it is a challenge, the proof of which will be determined by how we fulfill it. But I think one cannot say that we are less credible. You can say we are less popular. You can say that we have more obstacles to improving relations on the street in Cairo and Amman and Sana'a and elsewhere. But one cannot argue that we are less credible. We are far more credible today than we were 21 days ago. Now, what should the United States do on democracy? Here I'll be just telegraphic since I know my time is short. Very good. 2 days ago, I was very proud that my institution, the Washington Institute, issued this document, which is called Winning the Peace in the Middle East, a bipartisan blueprint for post-war U.S. policy. This was endorsed by two former secretaries of state, Republican secretaries of state, Larry Eagleburger and Alexander Haig, Democrats like Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, Senator Bob Kerry of Nebraska, former Senator Fred Thompson of Tennessee. It's quite a bipartisan group. And on this, the issue of democracy in Iraq was a very important theme of this paper, which I'm proud to say I edited along with my colleague Dennis Ross. Now, let me just quote, since the wording, I think, speaks for itself, some of the ideas about how you build a new regime in Iraq. Of course, the best means to ensure that the regime is reconstructed and transformed is to ensure it has a broad-based government that respects the dignity of Iraqis, launched on a sustainable process of democratization. No more strongmen. Rule by strongmen and domination by one ethnic minority has been the problem of Iraq for the past generation. There will be 3 phases: immediately stabilization, which is essentially what's going on now, the role of U.S. forces and others. Then the moment of transition, and third, a new government. This can range from months to years, and this will be a process that takes years. It will be a mistake to create prearranged timetables. Now, building a more broad-based representative government is the most important way to ensure legitimacy. Throughout, we have to have a vision of a democratic Iraq while maintaining realistic, achievable expectations of what can be accomplished in the short run. For, as I think all of us on this panel will agree, democratization is a process. It's not a one-time event. Our early focus needs to be on building institutions, such as a free press and political parties, and advocating principles, such as free speech, minority rights, and the rule of law, that are elements, essential elements of democratic development. Before free elections can take place, political authority should be spread widely, rather than put in the hands of a single leader. We urge the creation of two councils, an executive council and a larger consultative council. The executive council, we urge, should not have a fixed chairman, as is Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan, but rather a rotating chairman, so as to give the sense that there is no single person that the U.S. has endowed with authority. We need to find a way to empower Shi'is with participation that reflects their role in society in such a way that does not also that does not feed the apprehension of Sunnis that they're being marginalized. And this can be done. I think the larger point here is that all Iraqis have a fear, have a very real understanding that their country can fall apart if they don't handle it properly. I know that Kurds do. I have spoken to dozens of Kurds in the last couple of years. I do not know a single Kurdish leader who believes that independence is now the root for Kurdish political aspirations. Kurds will be very pleased with a federal Iraq that provides them with autonomy to build their own culture, their own national home within a unitary Iraq. Now, as far as the formation of the new government, we do believe, we would advocate, that it is important that there is a more broad-based international role. We urge that many countries that are now in the coalition play an even larger role as we move in the process of transition, in the process of forming a new government. We think it would be a mistake if neighboring countries play any role in this, but there can be a role for other Muslim-majority countries, and even a role for some Arab parties further afield from the immediate neighborhood. But we have to understand what the larger prize here. The larger prize is the actual creation of an Iraq free for the Iraqi people. It is more important that that goal be attained than the interim measures be as dispersed as possible. My last point is this. There used to be an environmental bumper sticker which was think globally, act locally. In Iraq, the idea has got to be, it's a bit less mellifluous. We have to think grandly, but act incrementally. Think grandly, but act incrementally. Iraqis are already today better off than they were 26 days ago. The process is moving in the right direction. They know the nasty neighborhood in which they live. They know that they live next to a theocracy in Iran. They know they live next to a different form of theocracy in Saudi Arabia. They know they live next to a Ba'athist tyranny in Syria. They know the neighborhood. They do not believe that they're going to be Luxembourg or Sweden tomorrow. We don't have that worry. So we know that we have to just be moving in the right direction. Doing that is what the game is all about. And so far, I think that we are doing just that. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Scott for inviting me and the sponsors for making possible this excellent conference. The previous speaker said that those were mistaken who thought that the war would cause violent conflict between Shias and Sunnis or between Kurds and Turks. I think that's premature. It's too early to tell. It reminds me of a story about Zhou Enlai, who was asked what he thought the most important consequence of the French Revolution was, to which he replied, "It's too soon to tell." I'm not sure we have to wait that long, but I think we should wait a bit longer before we decide whether any of these scenarios of conflict really transpire. And I'm hoping that that sort of cautious attitude will inform what I have to say. Let me begin with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on Iraq. I'm not an expert on democratization. And I think from that you can infer that I'm not an expert on democratization of Iraq. The best that I can hope to do is to just suggest a few points and then a proposal which you'll have to judge is whether it's modest or not. We have to distinguish, obviously, several questions. First, who should be in control of political reconstruction? Second, what should be the short-term and long-term goals of political reconstruction? And third, how do we get there? I'm going to concentrate on the who should be in control and the how do we get there questions because I think there's a sort of obvious, though somewhat superficial answer to the question of what we should be aiming for, namely democracy. Now, the obvious alternatives for answering the who question are, on the one hand, the U.S. and Britain, to a lesser extent, being the dominant controllers of the process, with the UN playing a subordinate role, or vice versa, the UN playing a bigger role, and the U.S. playing a supporting role along with the UK. Well, how would you decide between those alternatives? There seem to be two criteria. One is effectiveness, what would be the most effective arrangement for control, and the other is entitlement, who's entitled to control. It's interesting that the Bush administration seems to be making some assumptions about who's entitled to control. First, let's take effectiveness. The problem with the U.S. being the dominant partner in some cooperative arrangement for control of the transition, of course, is that the U.S. goes into this with what you might call a rather large legitimacy deficit. And it seems to me that some significant role for the UN is the only way of ameliorating that deficit. Then the question is how much role for the UN. I'm not assuming that it would be best from the standpoint of effectiveness if the UN had the dominant role. I think there's an obvious problem with that, namely the divisions among the Security Council members that we saw in the run-up to the war might very well paralyze any decision-making about the reconstruction if the UN had the dominant role. So from the standpoint of effectiveness, it's not clear at all to me which of those two alternatives is correct. But it should be remembered they're not really stark alternatives. They're questions of proportion of the relative roles of the UN versus the U.S. or the coalition. And what about the entitlement question? The Bush administration sometimes talks as if the fact that the U.S. has shed the blood of its citizens and spent a great deal of money in conflict makes it clear that we should have a dominant role in reconstruction. I'm not so sure that follows. It certainly wouldn't seem to follow if it turns out that the military action was a mistake, that in fact there was no sound case for the preventive use of force. Now, yesterday I suggested during one of the discussion periods that we ought to consider more than the two alternatives that are usually considered in discussing the justification for the preventive action. The first alternative is simply to stick with the UN-based blanket prohibition against any preventive military action. If you hold that view, then you'll conclude that the U.S. action, the coalition action, is unjustified. The other alternative that's usually discussed as the only alternative is to have the kind of unconstrained, eye of the beholder, expanded right of self-defense promoted by the Bush administration. That is, get rid of the blanket prohibition on preventive force and announce a right of self-defense that includes the right to use prevention without any sort of international institutional arrangements or criteria for accountability to limit abuses and errors in the exercise of such a right. Third alternative, the one that I endorsed, I just mentioned yesterday, is what you might call a multilateral accountability regime that includes, in effect, a binding contract according to which the state using preventive force agrees ex ante to an impartial review of the decision to act ex post. In other words, afterwards you have to be accountable to some international body as to whether, in fact, what you said was true, that there was good evidence, that there was a dire threat that needed to be dealt with by prevention. Now, Article 51 of the UN Charter includes a provision for reporting after the fact of military intervention. It says that if the state exercises the right of self-defense without prior UN authorization, it must report to the Security Council and give an explanation of why it did this. But the problem is that Article 51 has no content. It doesn't specify any criteria. It doesn't specify any kind of procedure of reporting. It doesn't require that the state acting in defense should share information on the ground about why the action was undertaken. And it provides no sort of accountability whatsoever. There are no consequences to having a negative evaluation of your report after the fact. Now, suppose that we had an accountability regime of a modest sort. We somehow institutionally made Article 51 more robust so that after the fact of the military action in Iraq, the U.S. had to be evaluated, had to make a report which would be evaluated by some, we hope, impartial international body. Not necessarily the Security Council. It would be better if it weren't the Security Council and if the veto weren't involved. And suppose that it flunked that report card. Suppose that no biological or chemical weapons turn up. Suppose the threat was exaggerated. At that point, it would seem to me to be very problematic to say that simply because the U.S. has shed blood and spent taxpayers' dollars, it's entitled to control the reconstruction. In fact, that seems quite counterintuitive. Now, I've just tried to be provocative and throw out some questions that would challenge what seem to be the current assumptions about the right or entitlement of the U.S. to control the reconstruction. I now want to shift to probably an equally sketchy discussion of the how question, how we get toward the goal of reconstruction to a democratic Iraq. And this requires some consideration of what the long-term goals are, and some of them have already been mentioned. I think it's clear it should be a democratic country. There are very difficult questions about how unitary the country should be. Most people think some kind of federalism would be appropriate, presumably with the Kurdish area in the north being one federal unit, whether they're at war, whether it's an asymmetrical or symmetrical federalism, some form of associationalism. There are lots of issues there. And my belief is that those questions about which kind of federalism simply can't be answered right now. And that leads me to my modest proposal. Instead of trying to decide now which of those alternatives is correct, instead of trying very soon to institute voting procedures in Iraq, and certainly before trying to help the Iraqis draft a new constitution, we might try an approach that uses the idea of unbundling the attributes of sovereignty. Instead of asking when or under what conditions will Iraq be ready to function as a fully fledged independent state with all the powers of sovereignty, we should think of a process of development toward full sovereignty that utilizes the notion that the attributes of sovereignty can be unbundled, and that there can be a process of what might be called conditional, provisional, and partial recognition of a new Iraq. Something like this is going on, or at least people hope it's going on, in Kosovo. The basis of the conditional, provisional, incremental recognition strategy is the premise that being recognized as a full-fledged, legitimate state is a big carrot. It's something that people want. Because it's a big carrot, the point at which a people seeks recognition as a functioning equal member of the club of states is a point of considerable leverage. The desire for recognition can be a powerful incentive for conforming to norms that specify the requirements for recognition. this approach was tried half-heartedly at the time of the breakup of Yugoslavia. The Council of Europe's Wadensar Commission came out with a set of criteria that were supposed to be satisfied before new states emerging from the breakup of Yugoslavia were to be recognized as legitimate. These criteria included guarantees of the rights of ethnic minorities, a very important item as we found out in the case of Yugoslavia. But the Commission's recommendation for a normativized practice of recognition failed because it wasn't really binding, it had no teeth. Germany and then others defected from the agreement, and in the opinion of many, prematurely recognized Croatia. The Croats issued an inflammatory declaration of independence, stating that Croatia was a state for the Croats, not for the Serbs. Persecution of the Serbs proceeded apace. The Serbs responded in kind, and we all know what happened. Now, I think there is probably a serious danger of ethnic and religious conflict in post-Saddam Iraq. There's also a danger, which I think should be minimized, and that Professor Litvak mentioned yesterday, that a militarily humiliated Iraq, ordered by its former enemy Iran, may eventually seek to remilitarize, and even perhaps to develop weapons of mass destruction after the coalition military forces have pulled out. Getting rid of Saddam Hussein is not going to automatically take Iraq out of the Middle East. Now, given that all of this is so, it makes sense to consider a process of incremental recognition with each successive element of sovereignty conferred only on condition that normative requirements have been met. One advantage of such a process it would allow the postponing of some important issues which no one has the information to deal with now, including the question of what sort of federal state or consociational state Iraq ultimately should be. I want to conclude by just summarizing what it takes to be the advantages of this kind of provisional, conditional, incremental sovereignty approach. First, as I just suggested, given that there's a danger of ethnic and or religious conflict, this approach provides leverage over the citizens of Iraq and their emerging leaders to conform to human rights norms. Second, if it turns out that there's a breakdown of cooperation and conflicts emerge between Shias and Sunnis, between Kurds and other Iraqis, it may be necessary to reintroduce military force either by the UN or the United States. At that point, if the status of Iraq is something like that of a UN protectorate rather than a full-fledged sovereign state, that's one less obstacle to intervening militarily. It's generally a system of states in which states guard their sovereignty. It's generally much more difficult to intervene against a state that's recognized as a fully independent sovereign state. A third advantage, we've also alluded to, this incremental approach postpones decisions as to what the ultimate political settlement should be. What sort of democracy, what sort of federalism, etc. My point is that we're not in a position to answer any of those questions in advance, and that what finally emerges as the best answer to those questions will be path dependent. It will depend upon the process as it goes along. And instead of simply saying, well, we're going to have a short interim period and then we're going to turn over the government of Iraq to the Iraqis and pretend that we now have a state that is ready to take its place as a full-fledged member of the Society of States, when in fact what we've got right now is a failed state. It appears increasingly clear that we have a failed state. The looting, the breakdown of order indicates that. If that's the case, then we need not just a process of state building, but some process that provides leverage to make sure that that state building goes in the right direction. And this idea of provisional conditional recognition, I think, is one way of trying to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. This was very interesting. I think it shows that we've been talking at the dinner table yesterday evening on democratization, I would say that at least the common word that I've heard very often is incrementalism. And I think to begin with, Scott has shattered my youthful dream that the US is doing all of this idealism and spreading democracy all over the world for the good cause, telling us basically it's because of national security, national interests that this is happening. Marina as well, I thought, was focusing quite a lot on incrementalism and that perhaps the rebuilding should take more time rather than less. And of course, Robert told us that we should think grandly but act incrementally. Finally, Alan, I thought, was focusing quite a bit on the phased-in sovereignty and talking also about rebuilding incrementally, not necessarily in one go. I hope you'll find the time to ask all the questions you want to ask, but the timing looks as follows. I think we have something like 20-25 minutes for questions. And I suggest you take the microphones that are in the back and only start speaking once you have them. Yeah. In the back, sir, yes?
I've heard the panel. I'm Barry Block, General Counsel for the State Board of Mortuary Science. The panel has, in my view, danced around a question I think needs to be addressed. Whether our federal government or the NGOs have considered this contingency or not is not apparent at all from the discussion, and that is what if the Sunnis and the Kurds and Shiites ultimately express to the international community that they have very real aspirations toward having their own independent nation states. What if they come to us and ask for internationally organized and supervised plebiscites on that question? Will our legitimacy increase or decrease by granting them that? And wouldn't that also lead to possible positive international developments? Would the members of the panel please address that possibility?
Perhaps we can have 3 questions or so and then you answer them in one question. Yes, sir? Yeah.
I've got it.
Can someone bring the microphone for this second?
I've got a couple questions as well.
Okay, go ahead.
Primarily for Dr. Satloff. One comment and one question, specifically on the myth of U.S. being, Islamophobic, I suppose. I think you make a good point about the U.S. and I wish you'd responded to this, the U.S. statements not being inflammatory about Islam, but obviously we know that there are plenty of people in the United States that do have a phobia. Even on our National Day of Prayer, someone with a lot of respect in the U.S., Franklin Graham, saying some fairly inflammatory things. And we also know that the governments that are friendly to us in the Middle East had people on those planes on September 11th. So I'm not sure that official policy can quell those fears. The second, and I wish to comment on that, the second question, primarily though, and a tough question, is your point about the U.S. setting up democracies that are favorable or not favorable, and that's still being in our self-interest, and I can appreciate that. However, now that the United States has set up the precedent of preemptive self-defense, what does that mean for a friendly or unfriendly Iraq in terms of its neighbors? You stated that a democratic Iraq in any form would not undertake that. How might a democratic Iraq use preemptive self-defense?
Richard Linderman with the University of North Carolina. I guess my question is, as we've talked about the hurdles facing the rebuilding and stabilization of Iraq from the inside, what hurdles do you see or opposition from the neighboring countries as far as possibly, militant Islam moving into the area, arguments against a democratic country?
I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that Iraq could divide into several states. But I think it would be a mistake to place that option on the table early in the process. Secessions are almost always violent and messy. And an advantage of the process that I described, the incremental phased sovereignty process, is that you could first try for a less radical way of dealing with pluralism in the country. And if in fact it failed in the end, it would still be an option to consider the possibility of splitting the country up. But I think generally it's a mistake to introduce the option of secession early on, in part because people use the threat of secession as a strategic bargaining tool to disrupt the process of building the country to extract bargains.
First, about the question of 3 Iraqs. I think when you look a lot more closely at Iraq, you see how difficult it really is to imagine this as a serious possibility. Take the city of Baghdad. The city of Baghdad is the largest Kurdish city in the world. The city of Baghdad is also the 2nd or 3rd largest Shiite city in the world. It's difficult to imagine how you create 3 different Iraqs when the population is in fact much more interspersed than most people think. There is not a neat division between a Kurdish north, a Shiite south, and a Sunni center. Iraq doesn't work that way. Second point is, just to reiterate the point that I made while I was talking, I do not know of a single Kurdish leader who advocates independence, or who has advocated independence for the last decade. The Kurds have been stabbed in the back so many times that their aspirations have been lowered so many times that they are now far more realistic than people give them credit for. And the achievements that they have made in the last decade in northern Iraq is a testament to that. They have got a functioning government running up there, and still have taken virtually no steps toward independence. Just a couple of comments about the other question that I was asked. First, about Islamophobia. Well, it's apples and oranges. One has to make a clear distinction between what this American preacher, that American professor, this American private citizen says, and what the U.S. government says. We hold that standard. We should hold that same standard to other people around the world. I shouldn't worry that much what this or that preacher in Iran or Syria or Egypt says, but I should matter a whole lot about what the president of Iran or the president of Egypt or the president of Syria says. And that's what they should hold us to. And that's the only legitimate standard. About democratic Iraq using preemptive self-defense against its neighbors, I suppose, we should worry about democratic France using preventive self-defense against Britain. But with Iraq, I think that if you look at the last generation, it's been aggressive Iraq, not preemptive defense Iraq, that has been the problem. I see much less of a problem, in the future on this. The problem of neighboring countries and democracy, yeah, they're damn worried. They're all worried. For lots of reasons. They're worried because there's a couple 100,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. If you're sitting in Iran today, you have U.S. troops on every border. U.S. troops in Uzbekistan, U.S. troops in Afghanistan, U.S. troops in Pakistan, in the Gulf, in Turkey, and Iraq. You can bet your bottom dollar that the Iranian mullahs are worried that the United States has Tehran next in their sights. Now, chances are very unlikely that we're actually going to move militarily on Iran, but the power, the political power of that, combined with the message of a progressive move toward democracy in Iraq, I think could prove the tipping point for political change inside that country.
On the issue of could Iraq divide into 3 countries, I think that is extremely unlikely. I mean, I think it really, first of all, I totally agree with Rob here that it's not, Sunni and Shias don't divide easily, just in terms of their geographical distribution. The Kurds are more of a compact group and it's more thinkable, but it's not, certainly Shias and Sunnis do not divide easily. That does not mean that if the situation is not handled well, it could not lead to ethnic conflict. I mean, Bosnia is not exactly divisible. In fact, that's why the conflict there has been so horrible. And, you know, relations among ethnic groups get out of hand. I don't think it's going to happen, very frankly, in the case of the relationship between the Shias and the Sunnis. But it's very important. I mean, that extract from this report that the Washington Institute had published that Rob read stresses that we have to, you know, it's important that the Shia play a leading role without frightening the Sunnis, and that Kurds have enough autonomy without becoming independent. There are a lot of delicate balances, I think, that need to be reached on all these issues. They can be reached, but it's also possible that if things are not handled well, the situation is going to spin out of control. Unfortunately, it has happened elsewhere, and that really would be very, very serious. So I think it's you know, we are much more, in terms of what challenge the U.S. might face, is not so much that of you know, three ethnic groups expressing the desire for independence, but it's more finding impossible in the end to bring them together in a political system that works for all the groups. But that is the worst case scenario, and I'm not saying that this is what is going to happen. On the issue of you know, the myth of U.S. Islamophobia, the issue to me is not whether or not there is Islamophobia expressed by the U.S. government. There is not. I think there was a serious slip that Bush made at the beginning when he talked about a crusade against Saddam Hussein. That was the very poor choice of word. I don't think it was deliberate, frankly. I think he used it figuratively without realizing that in that part of the word, crusade has a very specific meaning. And that was, but I don't think that was deliberate, and I don't think it's something that really has been held against him in the long run. The problem is not Islamophobia. The challenge is, how does the U.S. relate to Islamist movements, to political Islam? It's easy not to be Islamophobic. It's a bit more difficult to know how do you relate to political Islam and to Islamic movements. The classic example is that of Algeria in the 1992 elections. You know, where it looked very likely for a moment until the elections were suspended that another militant Islamic party, and I'm not talking about a party like the one in Turkey, but a much more militant Islamist party would have been elected if the elections had continued. That were the challenges. It's not Islam, but it's really dealing with these political movements. And finally, the issue of the you know, the neighboring countries and so on. I think it's yes, they are very worried about the U.S. military presence. Would they be worried about a more democratic Iraq? I think it depends on how democratic Iraq is going to be, what kind of example is going to set. I think there is a very clear, if a lot of the democratic reform end up by being very superficial and very cosmetic, I think a lot of countries in the region will go along. I think we'll see a lot of superficial reforms in all the neighboring countries, which the U.S. probably will applaud much more than they deserve to be applauded. We'll see a lot more women being appointed to prominent positions. We might even see some elections like the ones that took place in Bahrain. I suspect that we'll see much more of this kind of change in the Gulf countries, that is, countries that rush to give themselves a more democratic look, a more democratic facade, without taking any steps that will really affect the core power of the government. The elections in Bahrain were very interesting in this respect because these were elections which were highly applauded in the US, by the way, for a parliament, only 50%, parliament that has virtually no power, and where only 50% of the members are actually elected, with the others being appointed. And there was, you know, a lot of approval for these elections. So I think what we see is a lot of countries moving themselves, positioning themselves to try and give themselves a more democratic look without really getting to the core issues of what a democratic country is.
I guess I'll just comment. I mean, I think that's kind of covered the ground. Since themselves have made it very clear to us, and we continue to make it clear to them, that it is in their own best interest to remain part of a unified Iraq. And, you know, in Salahuddin in 1992, the principles that were decided there have basically set the stage, and there hasn't been too much deviation from that. The notion is a unified Iraq that allows for a good deal of autonomy, but there's, as long as we continue to make incremental progress and we have a process in place which leads to that ultimate reality, I think that it is premature, and most people agree that it's premature to be thinking about that. Again, who would provide the security for that? Who would provide the recognition for that? It is a Turkish red line for the Kurds, and they know it. So there, you have to, at some level, have faith that people will act in their own best interests. And I think the leadership, this is not a new question. This is something that has been being debated and talked about among the Iraqis themselves for a very long time. And of course, we have been active in those discussions for a very long time. In terms of the neighboring countries and the idea of Iraqi preventative aggression or whatever, I think that, I mean, Rob has covered the territory there, that it will take a long time for Iraq to provide for its own security, I think. And therefore, the United States will have to have some presence there together with other coalition troops or whatnot. But it will be a while before they'll be able to have defend their own security. And I think that the neighbors, as Rob has already intimated, I mean, Iran, I think Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz mentioned yesterday, Iran had a 7-year-long war with Iraq. And they watched the United States decimate the regime in 26 days or whatever. So they know that there's a lot of power there, and they are surrounded by it, and they have a lot of concerns. And we're going to have to help manage those. I also think that it was mentioned earlier, some skepticism about the support of Middle Eastern governments to an eventual government in Iraq. I think, in point of fact, I think you'll see a lot of the countries in the region recognize the new government fairly quickly, because I think they'll see it in their own best interest to do so. But we'll see. The other thing I want to say, there seems to be some, and you know, it's our fault. We're not expressing ourselves very clearly on a lot of these things, but you know, the interim authority is an interim authority. It is not a sovereign government. The idea is that Tommy Franks, as combatant commander, will have control over Iraq. Jay Garner is in his chain of command, and one man will decrease and the other man increase. The IIA will be there, but it will be an interim authority. The only government that will be open for recognition by the international community will be the new government of Iraq that comes into place after elections. I think that could be a very long time, it could be a short amount of time. I think most people are fairly realistic that it's going to take a while to get these processes in place. But there's not going to be a rush to elections. There will be deliberation, but again, the Iraqis themselves have thought a lot about these issues. Part of the State Department ran a thing called the Future of Iraq Project, which has been bringing together Iraqis from all over the world, including from within Iraq, to meet together to discuss a variety of issues. One of those working groups was on transitional justice. And in that group, they were incredibly productive. I mean, they reviewed every existing Iraqi law. They made recommendations as to what changes would need to be, laws that need to be implemented immediately, etc. And there's a great deal of thought and legitimacy in that work, and we need to build on it. But this isn't something that we're coming from and thinking of Iraq as some sort of tabula rasa. It's not, and we recognize that. You know, there are a lot of very thoughtful both sides of the river up there who have given a lot of thought to these issues for a very long time, and they're not naive.